Hello and welcome to this brief from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askari. Today is Tuesday, March the 5th. I just got off from an interview with the Chinese CGTN evening news, where they asked me to comment on the message delivered today by Premier Li Qiang from the government report to the 14th National People's Congress. What was the most important parts of that? And I made a short commentary there, but I wanted to elaborate more on that. As you know, we have ongoing 2 sessions in China now, which is the most important event in China. And it was a great opportunity for me in the evening news to say a few things from my perspective, from our perspective here in Sweden and in Europe. I think the most important message which was delivered, there are several messages, but the most important one delivered by Premier Li Qiang is that China is committed to continue its high quality industrial and technological development, and that this is the long-term strategy of China. There is no way China will move away from that path, no matter what happens around the country. Now, this happens you have enormous noise in the background where there is all this talk about China's economy slowing down or even collapsing and all this stuff. I mean, this is really, the Chinese government does not really, is concerned about that, because China survived the financial crisis in 2008. China survived the COVID-19 pandemic. China survived the Ukraine war. China is now struggling with the situation in the Middle East and the closing of the Red Sea and so on and so forth. So these are bumps and potholes on the long road. So the Chinese are not forgetting where they are going, because they have a plan with it until 2049 to make China the most advanced country in the world, a more harmonious, democratic, and beautiful country in the world. So there's no way China is going to change, and the Communist Party of China will change from that path. There will be stepping stone, of course, on the way, but the potholes today, like for example the real estate crisis, the stock market crisis, these are potholes on the road. The Chinese nation is not gonna stop its progress to fix that and focus only on that. They will let some people take care of that pothole while the march continues towards the longer term goal. And this is good news for the world, because if you put it in perspective, China's economy is the world's largest economy in purchasing power parity. China is the largest industrial power in the world. China is the largest manufacturer and exporter of industrial goods in the world. China is the main trade partner of 120 nations in the world. China has 400 million people of middle income, who are projected to reach 800 million people by 2030. This is an enormous market. And of course, China, as what I mentioned, one of the other points the Premier mentioned is the focus also on the internal market and the consumer market, because you have a huge consumer market in China, which could be a stimulus. But the important thing is that the Premier said that there will be no stimulus packages to fix the potholes happening now. Although he announced there will be about $140 billion, that's equivalent to 1 trillion yuan in long-term bonds, which will be issued to fix certain things going on now. But the long-term plans for China's progress and industrialization in many fields will continue. And this is good news for the world. For example, for the developing nations, China tends to share the fruits of its progress in terms of technology and industry and construction and everywhere with other nations, as we have seen with the Belt and Road Initiative. China will become a huge market for developing nations to export goods. As one of the important things which Chinese Premier mentioned is the question of food security. China will also be a very important market for industrial nations to export goods to the Chinese market. But also here in Sweden, for example, one of the things I mentioned on the Chinese TV this evening is that we benefit from China because we get intermediary products industrial products from China, very high quality but very affordable prices. We incorporate them in machinery and finished products here and sell it for higher value. This is very beneficial for the Swedish industry and also industries in the rest of Europe. But also we have some of the very important and industrial companies who have China as a very important market. And hopefully that together with China, we can start exporting machinery and construction and know-how to other nations to build the Belt and Road Initiative. So in this way, we also the Premier mentioned one important fact, which is important for the Swedish and industrial nations, industries, is that China will lift all restrictions on investments in the manufacturing sector. So you are free to invest as much as you want in the manufacturing industrial sector, but not to come in with hot money. This is one of the things which people say, oh, China is restricting foreign investment, it's not open. China is not open for hot money, speculative money, which wants to get into hot markets like the real estate market, the stock markets, the financial markets, shadow banking, and make enormous profits and run away from there. This is not what China is interested in. China is interested in long-term commitments for investments in the real economy, in the industries specifically. So this is where the difference is. China does not want financial speculators to swarm the Chinese market. It wants long-term investors and cooperation partners. The importance of China's commitment to industrial technological progress is very, very important, because China has been, actually this has been defined a long time ago by President Xi Jinping, that China must move from high quantity, low value export and industries to high quality industries. But this requires enormous investments in technology and innovation. And this has been a steady process which the Chinese have been focused on. And now they are leading in many, many sectors in the world, like in machinery, in robotics, in certain aspects of aerospace. China is also even producing its airliner now. China is a world leader in the space exploration. China is a world leader in nuclear power, but also in the future fusion power, the so-called artificial sun. So China will be leading in many of these fields. It will become leading in, of course, it's already leading in AI and quantum computing, but also in the chip market, which has been one of the Achilles heels of China's economies, that China is working intensively to become more self-reliant, because the West, especially the United States, is not willing to cooperate with China to supply China with what it needs from these semiconductors and chips. So China is going to have enormous, because if China does not leap forward, it will have what is so-called the middle income trap, because China cannot continue to produce cheap goods to the rest of the world, because other parts of the world are producing similar cheap goods now, like in the ASEAN countries and Mexico and others. So China cannot survive in that. It will stagnate. So China needs to leap to the next level of industrialization and remain the world leader in these sectors. Now, what the effect will be is that you will have what we call the pains of structural adjustment, where China needs to adjust to this new industrialized economy, which means that many of in the labor force, for example, they will need to adjust their own skills and way of working to the new technologies. And this means that many people will be left behind. They will might have on the short term painful, like unemployment and so on and so forth. But this gradually will diminish as the economy picks up. Now, very important to understand that China's economic ills are not simply an internal matter. Everybody's trying to magnify the real estate bubble in China, the real estate crisis in China, and say this is how China's economy is going to collapse. China's economy is hurt because the world's economy is stagnating. China's important partners, like Germany, has negative growth levels. Most of the EU, even the United States, all these numbers we hear about, the GDP growth and so on, are not really, these are fictitious numbers when we look at the real American economy. So many nations in the world have been hit by the COVID and the consequences of the COVID and the enormous inflation, which was a consequence of both the Ukraine war and the U.S. Monetary policy of raising the interest rates and so on. So China, as President Xi Jinping said it in the third Belt and Road Forum, he said, China can only do well when the world is doing well. And the world will do better if China is doing well. So this is really an economic policy. This is not a rhetoric. And China, as the world's largest exporter of industrial goods and manufactured goods, is affected. So China's problems are not a Chinese policy problem. These are part of the global crisis we face. So China is not going to quit its long-term plans to fix current issues. That's what people are quarreling about. Stimulus package. We need a stimulus package now to resolve this real estate problem. We need the stimulus to employ young people who are unemployed. The Premier Li Qiang said there will be no such things. We will continue on our long-term progress, but we will try to resolve these other things on the way. Now, one of the other issues which the Premier also mentioned is very important is that China remained committed to development in the rural areas to bridge the gap in the income, because we still have, although China has eliminated extreme poverty, we still have very poor areas in China, especially in the West and the Southwest, where development has not reached the levels which we have seen in the coastal areas in the South and Southwest and so on. So this remains a commitment by the Chinese government to support and finance. There will also be the question of food security. The Premier mentioned the fact, because we have a very insecure world. We saw what happened when the Black Sea was blocked and the goods from Ukraine, like grains, oils, and so on from Ukraine and even Russia, were blocked to the world markets. Many nations are dependent on foreign markets for their food. China wants to avoid that, because with 1.4 billion people, you cannot afford to rely on others for your own, at least basic food. But China will remain open for other agricultural products, of course, from around the world. And the Chinese market is big and has enormous appetite, especially for exotic products. So this is the food security is another important. Also, the fact that China remains committed to its policy for a greener, cleaner environment. China has done enormous efforts to green the country by afforestation, greening the deserts, but also greening all the cities, all the mountains, and cleaning the rivers and the lakes. You know what President Xi Jinping talks about: lucid waters, green mountains, and blue skies. That this is the goal. Although I have seen myself in many parts of China, you have green mountains, lucid waters, and blue skies. But there are still many, the effects of the rapid industrialization are still there, and China is going to continue to focus on that. The question of opening up, of course, the consumer market I mentioned already, because this is a very interesting thing for others to think about. For example, we have many industries in Sweden who are facing recession in Europe. So it would be very interesting for them to invest in the Chinese market, open industries, shops there for their products to survive. Now, the two sessions is mostly concerned, and the report was concerned about the internal domestic policy of China. But as we know, everything China does will affect the rest of the world. And I think the Chinese, we will see this more in the two sessions, even from others, not only the Premier Li Qiang, but also President Xi Jinping will deliver a message, but also the question of diplomacy, peaceful diplomacy, and actually using economic development as a means of achieving peace. This has been the standard Chinese policy, and it will have a very important role in diffusing the crises we have, like the horrible situation in Gaza with the Palestinian people suffering so much, and also the ramifications for that. As I mentioned, the blocking of the shipping routes, relatively blocking it in the Red Sea because of what the Yemen is doing in support of the Palestinians. We also have the Ukrainian crisis, which is becoming very, very dangerous, with the people talking about World War III and the NATO involvement in operations against Russia. This is a very dangerous, and the Chinese are sending, of course, a commissioner, an envoy to Europe to discuss these matters. So, but the thing is that China will remain focused on peaceful diplomacy, but also using economic development and cooperation as the tool and the means for achieving peace among nations. So these are some of the important points which I wanted to share with you, and we will remain tuned to other important outcomes from the 2 sessions in Beijing.